We are 8 episodes into the Rebranding Christianity podcast, and I have to admit, it's been kind of a bummer. But that's okay. The first step toward recovery is admitting there's a problem, and there is a big problem. The church in America is, for the most part, not known for the radical, selfless love that Jesus said should be our brand identifier, and that is a problem. So far, we've been diagnosing that problem, but now we're going to pivot and start looking towards solutions. In the next few episodes, we're going to ask, what does it actually look like to be the type of people and have the type of churches that are known for what Jesus told us to be known for? And I've been looking forward to these conversations for some time, so let's jump in. I'm Greg Holmes.
And I'm Cindy Park. And we're joined again with Jeff Jones and Mike Hogan, co-authors of the book, Rebranding Christianity. Welcome back, guys.
Yeah, thank you. And to your point, Greg, thank you, listeners, for hanging in.
Yeah, if you stuck
especially those who are Christians, because,
right.
You could get defensive and kind of give up, and that's not helpful. Getting taking ownership is helpful, and taking responsibility is helpful. So way to go, hanging in, and now we get to talk about.
And we could just, it's possible we're just talking to 2 people right now or something like that.
Which is fine.
Which is fine. Thanks for sticking with us.
Well, so those 2 listeners, it feels like a daunting task for the Christian community to be known by those outside the church as people of selflessness and outrageous love and grace. Jeff, I've heard you use a phrase, we've gone a long way down the wrong road, and I feel this. We have a long way to go, and this is an uphill climb. But I'm encouraged because the church has faced harder things in the past. So can you tell us what the first generation of the church faced in Rome and how did they overcome it?
Yeah, I actually spent a lot of time in that yesterday in church history. And it was so remarkable because, the Christians, one of the biggest mysteries of history is how did this tiny, maligned group of people around a dead Messiah that we know rose from the dead, but how did it survive? Yeah. Much less become the dominant force in the world in such a short time. And just from a secular history perspective, that makes no sense. And so, historians there's some great books and all that about that, but they all boil down to the same thing, that essentially it's what we're talking about in this book, that they really did win their world over through love displayed in a way that was people couldn't argue against. And so the kind of community that they developed had never been seen before. We'll talk about that more, or the way they loved their enemies and persecuted people, as they were in the face of persecution, and they were doing good, just like Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, doing good to their enemies and praying for their enemies and blessing their enemies. And even in the face of persecution, as they're being killed in horrible ways, praying for the people that are killing them, as well as we've talked about in pandemics, as they moved into sickness at risk for their lives and as they cared for the poor. But as I was reading yesterday, it was kind of cool because it was one of the emperors, who was a pagan emperor, Julian, who was really frustrated with the growth of Christianity and empire. So he writes all these letters to priests throughout the empire. And he's like, what are you guys doing? Because we're losing. All these Christians are growing, we're shrinking, do something about it. And part of that is he said, one thing is happening. He calls them Christians impious Galileans. These impious Galileans not only care for their own poor, but they care for the poor outside of themselves. And everybody can see it. And they can see that you guys aren't doing anything for them, but they are, And so he says, you need to start at least match their level of generosity, if not exceed it, so we can start, But it's just interesting hearing, reading, there was multiple letters to these priests just saying, because it was not in the Roman mindset to be charitable. They were stoic thing and weak people. You weeded out, you didn't help. And so it's just a very different mentality.
I tell you, going back to our conversation last time about our responsibility and culture, what a great example of culture shaping, because that kind of raised the bar of charity for everyone. Yeah. It's like, that's pretty cool.
But they won, through love displayed, really. And I'm secular historians, everybody looks and would say that's the primary thing that made Christianity thrive. They literally won over a world that was out to get them, because they had the whole Roman Empire misinformation campaign thing going, that Christians were cannibals, because of communion, the bread, that we were incestuous because we call each other brothers and sisters, and so that we practice incest, that they considered us atheists because we didn't believe in the Greek and Roman gods, and that's why when bad things would happen, they would blame the Christians and because of these atheists, and so on. So there was just all kinds of stuff working against Christianity, including the waves of severe persecution, but through love displayed, won that world over.
Yeah. Jeff, you make the point in the book that Jesus's prayer in John 17, I want to talk about John 17 here in just a minute, that Jesus's prayer in John 17 gives us one clue about how we can go about standing out because of uncommon love and grace, and it has to do with how we relate to each other in diverse unity, sort of with other Christians. And so talk to us a little bit about John 17 and why that prayer is such a big deal.
Yeah, so now we're shifting to the positive, right? How do we display the love of Jesus in a compelling way? And the first way to talk about is what Jesus prayed for in John 17, and that is this radical new kind of community that would display the kind of unity that a world can't really argue against. And so in John 17, it's the high priestly prayer. You may not realize it if you're a Christian that Jesus prayed for you when he was on the planet. This is the one time we know that. And he said, I pray for all those who would come to believe through the apostles' message. So that's you, if you have come to believe. And in the one thing he prayed for, he said, I pray that they may be one, that they may be unified, they may be one, just as you and I, God, are one, so that the world will know that you indeed sent me into this world. So that the world will know, think about how big the stakes are. So Jesus is about to die on the cross for the sins of the world, raised from the dead and all that. And he said, well, this is how people will know that actually happened and that's legitimate. This one thing. And it's that this new group of people, this new community would be one with the same kind of unity that Jesus shares with the Father. And so it's not the kind of unity that is expected. It's unexpected unity that can't be argued against. It's this diverse unity of people who are very different from each other, and yet, even with all their differences, form this mosaic, this unity that is compelling enough that a skeptical world can't argue against it and say, wow, I think the claims of Jesus are actually true, because where else does that happen?
Yeah. So I've grown up in the church, and so I understand this idea of what you're saying about Jesus came to tear down walls and help us to be diverse. And so even though I've heard that idea, those verses a million times, I went to a Korean church for like my whole life, essentially growing up, because I'm Korean. I went to Korean campus ministries when I was in college. My Christian life was pretty ethnocentric for a long time. And I know you get this because when you first got into ministry, you went to church with people that looked a lot like you. And then you made a shift. Can you talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah, for me, it was honestly a theological shift is where it started, and a biblical shift, not a practical one. So just looking at the New Testament, right? What we just said, Jesus' prayer in John 17, and then as the church is formed, Paul talking about the church in Ephesians 2, that it's this new community where at the cross in Ephesians 2, Jesus tears down the dividing wall between Jew and Gentile, which is one race and every other race, where now there's enmity, that he died to take away that enmity, to take away those walls, and to, in the church, form this new community of every race, every tribe, every tongue, every nation, that should not be together, but are together. Ephesians 3 to display to the spiritual realm, the demons and Satan that question his wisdom in the spiritual battle, to demonstrate his wisdom by pointing to the church. In the same way that Jesus said, this is how a world will know, God chooses this thing called church to show those who have opposed him, to say, no, look at my wisdom. Where else would this kind of unity happen? And the stakes don't get bigger than that. That's not a small thing. This is the gospel. This is the big cosmic battle that we're in. And all of it, he's saying, hey, my primary way to demonstrate my wisdom and beauty is this new community called church, this diverse group of people who should not be together, but are together because they're unified around Jesus. Because I've just began to see that, thinking, well, that's not the way we do church. And I was in seminary, and I was being taught church growth stuff, how you grow churches, which was the homogeneous unit principle, I remember it was called. And because the way in society, in sociology, people like to be with people just like them, right? And so if you want to grow a church, then kind of like a country club, right? Just make it like them, and then people will go, and because it's my preferences and my, all that is there, and that's generally how churches grow, just naturally. And I started to just look at it biblically and think that's gross. Mm-hmm. That's the opposite of what Jesus prayed for, the opposite of what God was talking about. If he's looking at Satan and demons and saying, look at my wisdom, look at that, the beauty of this, where else does that exist? And if it looks like every other country club or whatever, it's like, I'm not seeing it, So just, anyway, it was a theological thing to think. And then in heaven, right, we see every tongue, tribe, and nation around the throne of God, they maintain their identity, as obvious they were. And church is to be a representative of heaven to come, where the kingdom, the representation of the kingdom now, that's the full expression of it. And just realizing, man, that's not who we are, and it's who we're called to be. And it's the biggest struggle in the early church is also God getting, this Jerusalem church, 100, for the first 15 years of the church, it was all Jewish, 100%. Then how do we begin to expand it to the Gentile world and in the nations? And God waits for the first multicultural church in Antioch to then begin to spread it to the rest of the world, because that's the DNA he wanted spread, and not monocultural, but multicultural. So I know I'm sharing a lot of stuff here, and a lot of that's in the book, but it was really a theological thing for me, and a crisis of leadership, of just saying, man, we're not producing what Jesus prayed for. Mm-hmm. And so we're more, he has a dream, we're like his nightmare. Mm. And so how do we move toward being the kind of multi-everything church that has remarkable unity? How can we do that? And so that was where my thing started. And then saying, okay, as a church, we're going to lead differently, and we're going to learn as much as we can about how to be the kind of church Jesus prayed for, and knowing that he will empower what he wants. So we're not going to be on our own, and started making decisions in line with that, and to create a more multicultural, multi-ethnic expression of the church, which is the kind of church that Jesus is interested in.
Yeah. But being part of a diverse community is really hard, and it's not always in these huge racial issues. It's sometimes just like these small things. A few years ago, Peter and I invited a couple over for dinner, and while I was plating something, I was using chopsticks to transfer the food, and the wife paused and she exclaimed, "Oh my gosh, do you know how to use chopsticks? That's amazing." And I just had this really clear moment of like, wow, we're really different. Because for me, that would be like going over to your house and be like, "Oh my gosh, you know how to use a fork? That's awesome." And I had to really fight against this feeling of, I just want to be with people who have shared life experiences, and I want it to be easy and comfortable. So what have been some of the challenges for you as you've intentionally pursued a diverse community?
Yeah, it is different, right? So there's two different ways to create diverse church. One is, say we're going to have a majority culture, and all the preferences are going to go to them. But any culture can come. You'll love using forks. Yeah. Chopsticks why would you ever use those, right? Right. It's that kind of, you can do that kind of a thing. And I mean, you're welcome. Just leave your chopsticks at home, because they're not going to be, and you can do church that way, right? Where it's, and I think that's on the journey we're at as our own church is, increasingly moving from a one cultural preference thing where every other culture is welcome, to say, no, we're going to be a multicultural church. Mm-hmm. And we're going to so that we have multicultures around the table making the decisions about what church is and how we do church and how we engage our community. And once you make that step, then it does get a little bit more difficult, because that's tricky. Well, it seems like we're going to make everybody a little bit not so happy, Yeah. Because everybody's going to have to give up preferences, and people don't want to give up preferences. We're a self-focused culture. We're a narcissistic culture. We're a culture that wants to be comfortable. And we're going to encourage people to get uncomfortable and to not only maybe sacrifice some preferences, but also be in uncomfortable conversations where people don't have the same perspective and who disagree and aren't just going to I mean, that's rich and that's what you want, but that doesn't mean it doesn't come with some turbulence or, people not liking that. And so, for example, we, through some of the racial stuff that happened during the pandemic, we just wanted to get people together. We do have multiple ethnicities in our church represented, to be with people that don't look like them and learn from each other and hear each other's stories. Not try to preach to each other, not try to convince each other about their perspective. Just share your story of what it's like to be in this culture. And it was wonderful for most people, right? But there were some who really struggled with it because, like, I remember talking to one person who left our church in part because of it, who said, I went to one of those groups. He was a white guy. And he said there were, two of us white guys, an Asian girl, two African-American people, somebody else. And nobody seemed that interested in what I had to say. And it was just so frustrating. I decided to leave because nobody wanted to listen. Well, you get the perspective, right? He's there to speak, not to listen.
Yeah.
And so, and I know two other people in the group that had this incredibly rich experience and came to me crying. It was so deep for them and rich because they just couldn't believe that some of these stories were real, and it changed everything for them and how they perceive this other. But you have two different mentalities, right? So I think there's a lot of things you have to surrender in order to live into this. You have to surrender preferences. You have to surrender being heard over hearing and listening and learning from each other and none of those things are natural. Yeah. We're naturally just want to build life around ourselves and make it comfortable. And multi-ethnicity is not as comfortable, and I have to sacrifice some things myself. Now, what you get out of the payout is way richer.
Yeah, that was going to be my second question.
Yeah.
If that's the difficulty, like what have been some of the best parts of leading a community that's much more diverse now than maybe it was?
Yeah, to me, it feels like a difference between watching a black and white movie and a color movie.
Yeah.
The richness of colors in a mosaic community that God wants for us is just so much deeper and richer, And so I was talking over the weekend with a person in our church who from another culture, from Nigeria, and she was just reflecting on her experience here. And she was very positive and all, but as she was talking about it, the way she saw our church was so different than the way I tend to see it. And it was really helped. She had no idea how much she was teaching me. Me just listening to the way she conceived church and thought about church as family and what that meant for her. And it was so much richer than the way I tend to see, because the way I see it is I've got my family and I go to church, but for her, church is family, and which is biblical, that, but it's just not very American. And so it was, as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking, wow, I need to put you on the platform. We need to, and so it's just, it's the rich, it's more rich and colorful and helpful, and because Christianity is not ethnocentric or shouldn't be, right? It's above it all. And so it helps us see kind of at least for me, because I'm American, white guy, it helps me see, okay, my perspective is actually very limited. And so my self-focus is challenged. My individualism is challenged in the richness of community in a way that helps me be more like Jesus. It's also just a lot more fun. I remember we have some Filipino life groups in our church, and they told me, they invited me, and they said, hey, our food is way better than probably your food. And they were right. And I mean, it's a massive amount of food. We put some crackers out, there's people, we actually have some people, Mike and I are in the same life group. We do have some people that step up, but if I'm coming, I'm bringing some crackers and throwing some cheese out. But this was incredible. But then after a life group, they do karaoke. And that's just part of their culture, and they were like, well, and I was like, you do karaoke? And they're like, well, of course, we're Filipino. We don't get together without doing karaoke. I'm like, okay. It was the most fun life group I've ever been in, right? I mean, my life group feels lame compared to their life. But that was fun and rich, and and so, the payoff is way bigger than the cost, but there is a cost.
Yeah.
This choice about being diverse, you're really living it out. You make that decision in the way we staff at church, or even in the way that you share the platform, which is one, I feel like an unusual thing for senior pastors anyway, or leaders. They want to be in the spotlight a lot. They're reluctant to give away that power, but you're intentional about who you invite up there and the diversity that you want to be represented up there. What are some things that you've learned, though, in the choices that you've made to be intentional?
Well, those are great choices. You do, in a church, you do have to diversify the platform. And that's not just for show. Now, let's talk about show for a little bit, because there is actually value in that. And then when people come in, representation. They want to see somebody that looks like them. Like we're talking to somebody who has adopted, they're a white family that adopted a child who's from an Asian culture. And she was 11 years old, or when they came to our church, and our campus host at the time, came up and welcomed everybody, and who was also from Asian descent. And the 11-year-old daughter looked at them and said, she was crying. And she said, this is a church I could be. Like, I feel like I belong here. And all it was seeing somebody look like her, on the platform, realize, hey, this is for people like me too, And so there is value in that. But also, the reason it's not just the optics, right? It's the reason to have people from different cultures and genders and so on speaking into our church is they come with a different perspective that makes a richer church. It's not just one perspective from one culture, from one gender, from one experience. It's multiple experiences speaking into the life of the church. And that's a very powerful thing. Same way with our board, that we work to diversify, so that you're making decisions, or, our pastoral team or whatever, the more you can diversify that, the different kinds of decisions, better decisions, more informed decisions you'll make. But you do have to take those steps. So it's not just, again, a bunch of one culture and everybody's welcome. It's no, we're going to invite everybody to the table, and we're going to build a leadership table and a speaking table and a music table or whatever it is.
And it's a long journey.
Diverse. And it is. And just helping people see the value of that to diversify their own circle too, and in their own relational circle, and to get people to not be so comfortable being comfortable, and to hang around with people who don't look like them.
All right, Mike, you've been sitting quiet here for a little bit. I want to hear your perspective as a business leader, as a branding consultant, as a marketing expert. It seems like it's better and easier for businesses to have a crystal clear idea on who their target audience is. They can cater and serve that target audience. I think you used what was the term, homogeneous unit? Is that what it was? But what Jeff's been describing and what Jesus prayed for in John 17 is not that. How do you, as a business leader and as a consultant, but also as a Christian, how do you wrestle with these things?
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, I'd say, you're absolutely right. If I was advising a business, I would say figure out who your target is and focus relentlessly on them. And it's funny, I hadn't heard the term homogeneous church growth before today. And it's interesting because it strikes me as sort of a literal application of marketing principles to the church. Right. So probably very pragmatic. But one of the other things that Jeff, that you talked about was, throughout history, there's all these things that happened with the church that were unexplainable by any other means other than the action of God. Like, how did this small group of people become the most dominant force on the planet? And I think it's the same thing. I would say, I like the brand analogy, but that doesn't mean it's 100%. And I think this is a good example of a place where not only does it break down a little bit, but the truth is sort of the opposite. And what's interesting to me, though, is in a lot of ways, what makes the church stand out is the same thing that you were talking about in history, is that how can we violate all of these brand principles and still be very successful, right? And so it's and so I think, when it's working well, I think people would walk in and say, wow, this doesn't make sense according to this principle, and this principle, or whatever. Coke would never do this or whatever, but it's working for me. And that's what I really love, because clearly the church is called to have that kind of diversity. Now, I wouldn't say, that necessarily means, right, every church needs to be exactly the same either.
Right.
And so, but I think those values and the approach is always the same no matter where you are in the world. If you picked a church in, the middle of Kansas, and you picked a church in, let's say, Nairobi, Kenya, each of those with its values, they're trying to reach the community around them. But that also means that they're going to encounter a slightly different set of people, a different set of needs, and so on. And so what the kinds of things you see them doing will be very different because they're called to reach the culture that they're in. Yeah. But to me, what really stands out about it is exactly what you said. It's the fact that it can only work supernaturally because it seems to defy the principles of business and logic.
Yeah. And the two examples you just raised in Kansas or in Kenya, every culture is going to have natural barriers. That's just the way that we are as humans. There are going to be things that divide us. It could be socioeconomic things or cultural things or what part of town you live in or whatever. And so both Kansas and Kenya are going to have those, but they're going to be different, and so how the church goes about breaking down those barriers and doing something, because they know that God's heart is breaking down those barriers. And so they can just join in and make decisions that are in line with that heart, and it will appear supernatural because it is supernatural.
Yeah, and
All
on
right.
that,
go ahead, please.
On the supernatural thing, before I say that, we do live in a very diverse culture in North Dallas. So there are parts of the country that aren't that diverse. And so, to have the same kind of diversity that we're trying to go for, if you live somewhere with very little diversities, you have to fly people in or something, right? So you just need to reflect the diversity in your community. But it's beyond race and beyond ethnicity. It's socioeconomics. It's all kinds of things, right? It's Alabama fans and Auburn fans or whatever, it's
never the two shall meet.
That's right. So it's all, it's all kinds of diversity, but I think it's important to note, I love the way you guys have been talking about the only explanation for this being supernatural. And that's really what Jesus that was his point in the John 17 prayer. I don't think we brought out enough that Christianity was one of the reasons it was so remarkable to its original world that it went over is Roman culture was far more stratified and polarized and separate than our culture is. Rich and poor did not meet, just did not hang out together. And they were not in a community together, citizen and non-citizen, this race and that race, and even men and women. I mean, women were not considered at all equal. And that's why infanticide was just, all infanticide was we had a girl, we don't want a girl, and let's leave her outside to die. So there were a lot more men in the Roman world than women because of that. And so this was not equal and inclusive and all. That was not part of their culture. And same thing with religion. The religions didn't mix, and ethnicity, all that stuff. So when Christianity came along, it really was the first multi-ethnic, multi-socioeconomic, where, like in Galatians 3, when it says, in the body of Christ, there is no slave and no free. There is no this and that and men and women. Like, we're all one. Well, that was radical. Like, they had never seen that kind of culture, that kind of community. That did not exist anywhere else. And so, again, a skeptical world, watching a world looking on and seeing, wow, where else does that happen? Like, that's crazy. Like, where does that happen? And it did. And they not only were together, but loved one another and formed this whole new kind of community. And imagine in our world now, where I think people are so tired of the polarization and disunity and fragmentation into different tribes. I think we're at the same kind of, or a very similar kind of opportunity point of people saying, wow, look at that. Christians know how to do it. Like, in a world where we just can't get along and everybody's so polarized, man, it happens there.
Right.
What do they know that we don't know? And that's the kind of conversation that should be happening. And that's exactly what Jesus is praying for in John 17.
Yeah. I tell you, well, we need to wrap things up, but it has been so encouraging in this conversation to not just be diagnosing a problem, but to begin painting a picture of what a brighter future could look like, a future where the Christian community stands out for the right reasons. And one place we could start is by, just as you said, Jeff, joining God in his work of tearing down the barrier, the dividing line between people, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic factors, age, gender, all work to divide us, and we feel it. We are so divided. But God is working to bring unity that is inexplicable apart from him. And one positive thing that we can do is just to allow God to work through us to bring about diverse unity that he desires. And so those are the conversations we are in now. That's one thing we could be focusing on. In our next episode, we're going to talk about other positive steps we can take to rebrand Christianity together. So join us.